Hey man, welcome back to Vinyl Junkies. I'll be talking about this record right here, Forbidden Planet. This record has the distinction of being the very first electronic record ever made for a soundtrack as a movie. It was recorded in 1956 by a husband and wife team called Louis and Bibi Baron. Okay, basically the story went like this. When they got married, they received as a gift for their wedding one of the very first tape recording machines ever to be brought into the States. It was the same tape recorder that Adolf Hitler used to record all of his speeches, so that if he ever got kidnapped or killed or whatever, they can play the tape and people would still think that he was alive. The way the album came to be is Louis and Bibi Baron decided to move to Greenwich Village in New York, and they wound up being basically part of this art collective that was happening back then, that comprised of people like fucking Karl-Heinz Stockhausen and Edgar Varese and Tennessee Williams, Jackson Pollock, really like all the big names in the arts back then, Anais Nin, Henry Miller, a whole bunch of names. And while they were in this collective, they actually had a record label. They formed a record label for spoken word, and only 4 records were ever released on this label. Those records now sell for hundreds of dollars, but they had one by Anais Nin, they had another one by Tennessee Ford, they had one by Henry Miller, and I never fucking remember the last one. And finally they had one by Aldous Huxley, Brave New World. They still did have commission work with corporate clients such as IBM and Ford. Okay, but the thing is that they knew that if they were going to just do that, you know, their reputation would suffer. So what they did is they started developing soundtracks, electronic soundtracks for art house movies. At one point, there was the head of MGM Movie Studios that was in New York because his wife was going to open up an art exhibit. Okay, so they decided, the two of them, that, you know what, we gotta meet this guy. They had absolutely no idea what he looked like, but what Louis Baron told his wife was, you know what, just look for the guy that looks the least pretentious. So they wind up crashing the opening at the art gallery, and they look for the guy who looks the least pretentious, and it actually winds up being him. A week later, they wind up talking to each other, and they agree that they would make the soundtrack to this movie here, Forbidden Planet. The way it is that the music was created on this was, Louis Baron used to like playing around with soldering irons and circuit boards and stuff like that. So what he would do is he'd create circuit boards that would emanate sound and record those sounds on his tape recorder, and then he'd play with pitch control and, you know, start maneuvering the sounds, and that's how it is that they made the soundtrack to this. Okay, editing was kind of cool too, because, I mean, listen, obviously they didn't have editing software, so you literally had to cut the tape with a razor blade and tape it back together, and this is the way this record is put together. Okay, so this is really one of the examples, one of the very first examples of electronic music ever. Okay, another interesting story attached to this was that this record, back then, really received rave reviews. Everybody loved it, it seemed, but John Cage, who thought it sounded like a melodic piece of shit. And then there was a third party, which is the music industry, who decided that this isn't really music. They were deeply suspicious of, you know, tape-recorded music. That stuff didn't really exist back then. And that's why it is the album, you'll notice at the top, is called Electronic Tonalities, because electronic tonalities wasn't considered music. Because of that, the album could not be nominated for Best Soundtrack at the Oscars. As a matter of fact, MGM Studios didn't even release this as a record, as the soundtrack at all. Okay, this was released only 20 years later by the Barons themselves. Okay, they put together a record label called Planet Records, and the first 1,500 copies were autographed. So, I mean, if you check on the net, you're going to see that there's autographed copies of this record. So yeah, I guess that's my story about a record which contains music that the music industry doesn't consider music. I'm out.